She found a dying enemy crawling toward her cabin in the pre-dawn darkness. What she did next would change the course of two nations forever. In the autumn of 1876, as war raged across the Dakota Territory and hatred ran deeper than winter frost, Dr. Sarah Mitchell stood at the crossroads between two worlds. She was the only physician within 100 miles of Cedar Ridge, living alone on the edge of Lakota Territory with nothing but her medical oath and a loaded Winchester for protection. When she heard that desperate sound outside her door, somewhere between a groan and a prayer, she had no idea that the dying man in her yard was Iron Hawk, one of the most feared war chiefs of the Lakota Nation. She didn't know that saving his life would transform her from an isolated frontier doctor into something far more powerful, a bridge between peoples who had forgotten how to see each other as human. This is the story of courage that defied every rule of survival, mercy that conquered fear, and one woman's choice to heal instead of harm, even when that choice could have cost her everything. What unfolds will remind you that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is also the most necessary, and that healing has the power to transform not just bodies, but entire nations. Stick around, because you're about to witness how one act of mercy in the darkness changed the fate of the American frontier forever. The autumn wind of 1876 howled across the Dakota Territory like a banshee carrying whispers of war and the promise of a harsh winter ahead. The golden leaves of the cottonwood trees along Willow Creek had long since fallen, leaving skeletal branches that clawed at the gray sky like desperate fingers. Snow would come soon. The animals knew it, the plants knew it, and Dr. Sarah Mitchell knew it too, reading the signs in the nervous behavior of her horses and the way the birds had disappeared from the endless expanse of prairie grass. But nothing had prepared her for what she would discover crawling toward her cabin in the pre-dawn darkness of October 15th, a discovery that would test everything she believed about mercy, survival, and the thin line between civilization and savagery. Sarah had been living alone on the frontier for 3 years, serving as the only doctor within 100 miles of Cedar Ridge. Her small cabin sat like a lonely sentinel on the vast plains, positioned strategically between two worlds. Close enough to Fort Laramie to receive supplies and occasional military protection, but far enough into Lakota territory that she often found herself treating native wounded who couldn't reach their own medicine men without risking capture or death. It was a dangerous balance that had kept her alive through careful neutrality and a reputation for healing anyone who came to her door, regardless of the color of their skin, the uniform they wore, or the enemies they had made. She was known among the soldiers as the Angel of Cedar Ridge, and among the Lakota as the White Woman Who Does Not Judge. Both descriptions were accurate, though neither told the whole story of why a trained physician from Boston had chosen to exile herself to one of the most dangerous corners of the American frontier. Sarah had come west after losing everything that mattered to her in a single devastating summer. Captain James Mitchell, her husband of 6 years, had been a dedicated Army surgeon stationed at the Philadelphia Naval Yard. Their daughter Emily Rose had been the light of their lives, a bright, curious child with her father's gentle nature and her mother's stubborn determination. When the cholera epidemic swept through the city in the summer of 1873, Sarah had worked tirelessly alongside her husband, treating the endless stream of victims who flooded their hospital. But medical knowledge meant nothing when the disease came for their own family. Emily had fallen ill on a Tuesday morning, complaining of stomach pain and fever. By Thursday, she was dead, her tiny body unable to fight off the infection that had claimed thousands of others. James had lasted 3 more days, delirious with fever and grief, begging Sarah to save their baby girl even as his own life slipped away. Sarah had buried them both in the same week, standing alone at their graveside while rain fell like tears from an indifferent sky. The nightmares had started immediately, visions of tiny coffins and fevered faces, the sound of her husband's voice calling out for their daughter in his final moments. Sleep became impossible, work became meaningless, and the bustling city that had once been home felt like a prison built from painful memories. So she had fled west, seeking the kind of isolation that only the frontier could provide, hoping that helping others heal might somehow fill the void where her family used to be. She had chosen the Dakota Territory because it was dangerous enough to match her mood, remote enough to ensure solitude, and desperate enough for medical care that her services would be genuinely needed. The cabin she had built was modest but well constructed, designed by a woman who understood that survival on the frontier depended on careful planning and constant vigilance. The walls were thick logs chinked with mud and moss, strong enough to stop arrows and deflect bullets. The windows were positioned to provide clear sight lines in all directions, while remaining small enough to be easily defended. A root cellar beneath the floor held medical supplies and food stores, while a hidden compartment behind the fireplace contained emergency ammunition and gold coins for bribes or emergency travel. Her medical practice had grown slowly but steadily. Word spread across the territory that there was a skilled doctor at Cedar Ridge who asked no questions and accepted payment in whatever form people could offer. Cash from Army officers, trade goods from settlers, handmade items from native patients who had no money but possessed incredible skill with leather and beadwork. She had delivered babies in Army barracks and native lodges, set broken bones for cowboys and warriors, and treated gunshot wounds without asking whether the bullet had come from an enemy or a friend. The delicate balance she maintained required constant vigilance and careful diplomacy. When treating wounded soldiers, she never asked about military operations or troop movements. When healing injured Lakota, she never inquired about war party plans or sacred ceremonies. She was like a priest taking confession, present to ease suffering, not to judge or report on what she witnessed. But that careful neutrality was about to be shattered by a wounded warrior with an arrow in his back and blood on his hands. The sound that woke Sarah from her restless sleep wasn't quite human. Somewhere between a groan and a growl, carried on the October wind that rattled her cabin windows with the fury of an approaching storm. She had been dreaming about Emily again, reliving that terrible morning when fever had taken her daughter's bright eyes and replaced them with the glassy stare of approaching death. In her dream, she had been holding Emily's small hand, feeling the life drain away through her fingers, while her husband's voice called desperately from another room. For a moment, as consciousness slowly returned, Sarah thought the sound was part of the nightmare, an echo of her own grief made manifest in the darkness. But when it came again, closer this time, and definitely real, she bolted upright and reached for the loaded Winchester rifle she kept beside her bed. 3 years of frontier living had taught her that unusual sounds in the pre-dawn hours usually meant trouble was coming to call. Trouble in the Dakota Territory came in many forms. Renegade soldiers looking to settle scores away from military discipline, desperate outlaws fleeing posses and willing to kill for supplies, wild animals driven to dangerous boldness by hunger or disease, or war parties on the hunt for scalps and glory. The sound came a third time, and now she could tell it was coming from just outside her front door. Sarah pulled on her boots and heavy wool coat, checked the rifle's action with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned that hesitation could mean death, and crept to the window that provided the best view of her front yard. What she saw in the pale moonlight made her blood run cold, and her medical instincts roar to life simultaneously. A man was crawling across her yard, leaving a dark trail in the frost-covered grass that gleamed black in the silver light. Even from this distance, she could see the fletching of an arrow protruding from between his shoulder blades, angled downward in a way that suggested the weapon had been fired from horseback during a running battle. The way he moved, slow, agonized but grimly determined, told her he was still very much alive and probably very close to not being so. Sarah's medical training warred with her survival instincts in a battle that had become depressingly familiar over the past 3 years. Every rational part of her mind screamed warnings about ambushes and war parties using wounded men as bait to lure unsuspecting settlers into carefully planned traps. She had heard the stories, had treated survivors who bore the physical and emotional scars of such deceptions. The smart thing to do would be to stay inside, bar the door, and wait for morning to see if the man was still alive, or if he had friends waiting in the darkness. But the part of her that had taken the Hippocratic oath, that had dedicated her life to preserving and protecting human existence, wouldn't let her watch a fellow human being die on her doorstep. That oath had been the only thing that kept her sane during those terrible weeks after her family's death. the only anchor that prevented her from following them into whatever darkness waited beyond life. Sarah opened the door and stepped onto her covered porch, rifle ready but not quite aimed. The night air hit her like a physical blow, carrying the scent of approaching snow and the metallic smell of blood. In the distance, a wolf howled, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to echo her own isolation. The primitive fear that all humans carried in their bones, the knowledge that they were not the apex predators they pretended to be, crawled up her spine like ice water. "I'm armed," she called out in English, her voice carrying clearly across the frosty air. Then she repeated the warning in the limited Lakota she'd picked up from her native patients over the years. "Mazakan Yawa, I have a gun." The man stopped crawling and raised his head with obvious effort. In the moonlight, Sarah could see he was Lakota, probably in his 30s, with the build of a warrior and traditional braids that had come loose during whatever violence had put an arrow in his back. His face was painted for war, though the paint was now smeared and faded, and his clothing marked him as someone of importance within his tribe. The intricate beadwork on his shirt caught the moonlight, revealing patterns that spoke of high rank and sacred significance. His weapons, what she could see of them, were of exceptional quality, decorated with symbols that suggested spiritual as well as military authority. This was not just any warrior who had stumbled into her yard. This was someone whose absence would be noticed, whose death or survival could have consequences far beyond one man's fate. But what struck her most was his eyes, dark, intelligent, and filled with a pain that went deeper than physical wounds. These were the eyes of a man who had seen too much death, had been forced to make choices that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. They were eyes she recognized because she saw them in her own mirror every morning. "Help," he said in heavily accented English. The word barely a whisper carried on the wind. "Please." That single word, spoken with such desperate vulnerability, shattered the last of Sarah's hesitation. She had treated enough arrow wounds to recognize the signs of internal bleeding, the particular way a man moved when death was stalking him with patient inevitability. The shaft protruding from his back was buried deep, probably piercing vital organs, and the dark stain spreading across his buckskin shirt told her he'd been bleeding internally for hours. If she was going to help him, it had to be now, within the next few minutes, or it would be too late. The journey from her porch to where he lay felt like crossing a chasm between worlds. With each step, Sarah moved further from the safety of her careful neutrality and closer to a choice that could change everything. When she knelt beside him in the frost-covered grass, she could hear his labored breathing and see the way his eyes struggled to focus on her face. "What's your name?" she asked in English, then tried again in her limited Lakota. "Tuwe Hantu Chi Yo." "Iron Hawk," he managed, speaking in English with obvious effort. "Satan Maza, War Chief of the Oglala." Sarah's heart nearly stopped. She might not speak fluent Lakota, but she knew that name, had heard it whispered in fearful tones around Fort Laramie, had seen it printed on wanted posters offering substantial rewards for his capture, dead or alive. Iron Hawk was one of Crazy Horse's most trusted war leaders, a man whose tactical brilliance had made him a legend among his own people and a nightmare among their enemies. He was responsible for a dozen successful raids against military patrols and civilian settlements, a ghost who struck without warning and vanished like smoke into the endless prairie. The bounty on his head was substantial, enough to keep her comfortable for years, enough to buy passage back to civilization, and a new start far from the harsh realities of frontier life. All she had to do was let him die where he lay, then ride to Fort Laramie in the morning to collect her reward. But as she looked down at his pain-racked face, watching him struggle for each breath, all she could see was a dying man who needed her help. "Can you walk?" she asked. Iron Hawk tried to push himself up, made it perhaps 6 inches before collapsing back to the ground with a barely suppressed cry of agony. "Cannot move," he whispered. Getting him onto her examination table was an ordeal that left Sarah's back aching and her arms trembling with exhaustion. Iron Hawk was not a large man by frontier standards, perhaps 5 feet 8 inches tall and lean rather than bulky, but he was solid muscle and dead weight, and every movement caused him to emit sounds of pain that cut through her like knife blades. She half carried, half dragged him across her yard and through her front door, pausing every few feet to rest and check that he was still breathing. By the time she managed to get him positioned on the sturdy wooden table in her surgery, both of them were breathing hard and covered in sweat despite the cold. The arrow had entered at an angle, probably fired from horseback during a running battle, angling dangerously close to his heart. Sarah carefully cut away his shirt and examined the wound in the light of her oil lamps. The iron arrowhead was barbed, designed to stay put once it hit its target, which meant that simply pulling it out would cause massive internal damage and almost certain death. She would have to cut it out, following the shaft's path through layers of muscle and tissue while trying not to destroy anything vital in the process. It was delicate work under the best of circumstances, in a fully equipped hospital with trained assistants and proper surgical instruments. Here in her isolated cabin with nothing but her basic field surgery kit, it bordered on the impossible. "This is going to hurt," she told him as she prepared her instruments, laying them out on a clean towel with the methodical precision that had been drilled into her during her medical training. "A lot." Ironhawk managed what might have been a smile, though it was more of a grimace. "Everything hurts already." Sarah began by cleaning the wound area with carbolic acid, watching Ironhawk's face as the antiseptic burned into torn flesh. He gritted his teeth but made no sound, which told her something about the kind of man she was dealing with. Lesser men would have been screaming by now. The surgery took 4 hours. 4 hours of careful probing and cutting, following the arrow shaft's path through layers of muscle and tissue while trying not to cause more damage than she repaired. Ironhawk remained conscious for most of it, gripping the edges of the table so hard that his knuckles went white, but never crying out. The only sounds he made were harsh, controlled breathing and occasional whispered words in Lakota that sounded like prayers or curses. Sarah worked by the light of 3 oil lamps, her hands steady despite the knowledge that one wrong move could kill the man on her table. The arrowhead had passed between 2 ribs, puncturing his left lung and nicking an artery before coming to rest against his shoulder blade. Removing it required enlarging the wound channel and carefully manipulating the barbed point past the bone without causing additional damage to surrounding tissue. When she finally pulled the iron arrowhead from his chest and dropped it into a metal pan with a sound like a bell tolling. His pulse was weak but steady, his breathing shallow but regular. She cleaned the wound channel thoroughly with carbolic acid, packed it with clean cotton to control bleeding, and stitched it closed with precise sutures that her medical school professors would have been proud of. As the first light of dawn began to creep through her windows, Sarah allowed herself to believe that maybe she'd saved another life. She bandaged his entire torso with strips of clean linen, checked his pulse one more time, and covered him with her best quilt. Ironhawk had lost consciousness during the final stages of the surgery, his body finally surrendering to exhaustion and blood loss. But even as she watched his chest rise and fall in the steady rhythm of deep sleep, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that saving this particular man's life was going to complicate hers in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Outside, the wind had died down to a whisper, and in the distance she could hear the sounds of the frontier awakening, birds calling from the cottonwood trees along the creek, the distant lowing of cattle from a ranch miles away, the whistle of a train carrying supplies and settlers deeper into what had once been exclusively native land. But inside her small cabin, time seemed suspended as she sat in her rocking chair beside the examination table, keeping vigil over a man who was supposed to be her enemy. She dozed fitfully, waking every hour to check his pulse and breathing, to adjust his blankets, to listen for sounds that might indicate his condition was deteriorating. Ironhawk didn't regain consciousness for almost 24 hours. During that time, Sarah maintained a constant vigil, checking his pulse every hour, changing his bandages when blood seeped through the linen, and spooning thin broth into his mouth whenever he showed signs of stirring. She had learned from experience that the first day after major surgery was the most critical. The difference between life and death often came down to the body's ability to fight off infection and the patient's will to survive. She also spent those long hours thinking about what she had done and what it might mean. By saving Ironhawk's life, she had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. If anyone discovered what she had done, If word reached the military authorities or the territorial government, she could be charged with treason, aiding the enemy, or at the very least providing material support to hostile forces. But she had also done something else. She had proven to herself that her medical oath still meant something, that her commitment to preserving life was stronger than fear or political considerations. For the first time since her family's death, she felt like she had acted with purpose rather than simply going through the motions of survival. When Ironhawk's eyes finally opened, they were dark brown, almost black, and filled with the kind of weariness that came from waking up in enemy territory with no clear memory of how he had gotten there. "Where am I?" he asked in clear English, his voice hoarse but stronger than she had expected. "My cabin, about 15 miles southwest of Fort Laramie. You've been unconscious for a day and a night." Sarah continued checking his bandages, her movements efficient and professional. "I'm Dr. Sarah Mitchell." He tried to sit up, winced at the pain, and settled back against the pillow she had positioned behind his head. "You removed the arrow." "I did. It missed your heart by about 2 inches, but it punctured your left lung and nicked an artery. You're lucky to be alive." Something that might have been a smile flickered across his features. "Luck had nothing to do with it. Wakantanka guided me to a healer." Over the next 2 days, as his strength gradually returned, Sarah learned more about the man she had saved. Ironhawk spoke excellent English, having learned it from traders and missionaries over the years. He was intelligent, well-informed about the political situation, consuming both their peoples, and surprisingly philosophical about the war that had brought him to her door. "Your soldiers fight because they are ordered to fight," he told her one afternoon as she changed his bandages. "They follow the commands of men who have never seen this land, never walked these hills, never breathed this air. My warriors fight because this land is sacred to us. The bones of our ancestors rest here. Their spirits walk these valleys. How can a man sell the graves of his fathers?" Sarah could see from his jewelry, his weapons, and the quality of his clothing that he wasn't just any warrior. The intricate beadwork on his shirt told stories of victories in battle and visions received in sacred ceremonies. The sacred symbols carved into his knife handle spoke of spiritual authority as well as military rank. The eagle feathers in his hair were earned through acts of courage that had been witnessed and validated by his peers. "You're not just a war chief," she said. It wasn't a question. "I am Sitan Masa, Ironhawk, war leader of the Oglala Lakota, keeper of the sacred arrows, guardian of the people's winter counts." His voice carried quiet pride mixed with the weight of enormous responsibility. "And you are the white woman who heals both sides." Sarah's hands stilled on his bandages. She'd known her reputation had spread among the local Lakota tribes, but hearing it stated so matter-of-factly was both unsettling and strangely gratifying. "I heal anyone who needs healing. It's not about sides." "Your people would not see it that way if they knew you had saved me," Ironhawk said quietly. "They would call you a traitor. They would say you have blood on your hands." He was right, and they both knew it. If word got out that she'd saved the life of one of the most wanted men in the territory, her career would be over and her life might be forfeit. The army would see it as aiding and abetting the enemy, providing material support to hostile forces during wartime. The settlers would see it as betrayal of the worst kind, helping the very people who had taken so many of their friends and family members. But as Sarah looked into Ironhawk's dark eyes, she found she didn't care what anyone else might think. She had acted according to her conscience and her professional oath, and she would face whatever consequences that choice might bring. By the 3rd day, Ironhawk was strong enough to walk around the cabin, though Sarah could see it cost him considerable effort. His wound was healing cleanly, better than she had dared to hope, and by her estimation, he'd be ready to travel within another day or 2. But with that realization came the knowledge that their strange sanctuary was about to end. "Your people will be looking for you," she said that evening as they shared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread. Ironhawk nodded gravely. "Yes, I have been missing for 3 days now. My absence will not go unnoticed much longer." "Are you afraid of what happens when they come?" he asked, meeting her eyes across the table. Sarah considered the question honestly. She should be terrified. A lone white woman who had sheltered one of the most feared war chiefs in the territory, whose very presence could be seen as an act of war. But strangely, she felt more curious than afraid. Should I be? For the first time since she'd known him, Ironhawk smiled fully, not the grim expression of a man managing pain, but genuine warmth that transformed his entire face. That depends on what you believe about my people. Do you think we are the savages your newspapers describe? Sarah thought about the respectful way he'd spoken to her from the moment he regained consciousness, the gratitude he'd shown for her care, the intelligence and dignity she'd seen in everything he said and did. She thought about the careful way he moved around her cabin, never touching anything without permission, never taking advantage of her vulnerability. She thought about the stories she'd heard from her native patients, stories of honor and family loyalty, of deep spiritual connection to the land, of codes of conduct that valued courage and honesty above material wealth. No, she said firmly, I don't think you're savages. Then you have nothing to fear. My people honor courage and kindness above all other virtues. You have shown both. That night, as Sarah lay in her bed listening to Ironhawk's steady breathing from the main room where he slept on her sofa, she wondered what the morning would bring. She had no idea that it would change not just her life, but her entire understanding of who she was and what she was meant to become. She had no idea that she was about to become something that had never existed before, a bridge between worlds, built from compassion and strengthened by the belief that healing was more powerful than hatred. Sarah's eyes snapped open to a sound that made her blood freeze. The rhythmic thunder of horses, dozens of them, their unshod hooves beating against the frozen ground in perfect synchronization. It was still dark outside, perhaps an hour before dawn, but the sound was unmistakable and terrifying in its implications. She crept to her window and peered through the gap in the curtains, then had to grip the windowsill to keep from falling, as the full scope of what faced her became clear. 30 Lakota warriors sat their horses in a perfect line facing her cabin, close enough that she could see the war paint on their faces and the weapons in their hands gleaming in the pale moonlight. They weren't positioned for attack. Instead, they waited with the disciplined patience of professional soldiers, arranged in a formation that spoke of careful planning and absolute confidence in their own power. At their center sat a figure that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Even without formal regalia, she recognized him from descriptions she'd heard whispered around Fort Laramie with a mixture of respect and terror. Crazy Horse himself, the most feared war leader of the Lakota Nation. He was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 35, with shoulder-length black hair and features that seemed carved from stone. But there was an aura of controlled violence about him that made the air itself seem charged with electricity. "They have come," Ironhawk said quietly from behind her. Sarah turned to find him standing beside her examination table, fully dressed despite the fact that he should still be too weak for such exertion. Somehow, he'd managed to rebraid his hair and arrange his jewelry with careful precision, transforming himself from wounded patient back into war chief. The change was remarkable. Where there had been vulnerability and dependence, there was now dignity and authority. "Is that Tashunka Whitco?" she asked, using the Lakota name she'd heard spoken with equal measures of reverence and fear. "Crazy Horse, my cousin. He leads the search party sent to find me." "Search party?" Sarah's voice came out higher than she intended. "That looks more like a war party to me. In our world, there is little difference. But do not fear. If they meant you harm, you would already be dead. The fact that they wait means they wish to understand what has happened here. What do they want? To see that I am alive and well, and to understand why a white woman chose to save a Lakota war chief instead of letting him die for the bounty on his head." Sarah felt her throat go dry. She had tried not to think about the monetary value of the man she'd saved, but Ironhawk's words forced her to confront the reality of what she'd given up. "How much is the bounty?" Ironhawk's smile was grim. $500, dead or alive, enough to keep you comfortable for years, if you had chosen differently. The amount was staggering, more money than most frontier families saw in a year. Enough to buy passage back to civilization and a new start far from the hardships of the Dakota Territory. The thought hadn't even occurred to her when she'd found him bleeding and desperate in her yard. She'd seen only a man in need of help, not a source of wealth or a ticket to a better life. "I'm not a bounty hunter," she said. "Number you are something much rarer. a person who sees souls instead of skin color. Ironhawk straightened his shoulders, and she could see him transforming before her eyes from wounded man back into the leader who commanded respect and fear across the territory. I must go to them now. Will you come with me? Do I have a choice? There is always a choice, but some choices carry more honor than others. When Sarah stepped onto her porch beside Ironhawk, the effect on the waiting warriors was immediate. Several sat straighter in their saddles, and she heard murmured conversations in Lakota that sounded surprised. Whatever they had expected to find, it wasn't a white woman standing confidently beside their war chief, showing no signs of fear or coercion. Crazy Horse dismounted from his magnificent black stallion and approached with measured steps. Up close, Sarah could see the intelligence in his dark eyes, the way he took in every detail of the scene before him with the calculating gaze of a man who had survived by understanding his enemies better than they understood themselves. His clothing was simpler than Ironhawk's but of equally fine quality, and he moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent his life in the saddle. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the frosty air, pitched to reach every warrior in his command. Sitan Maza, he said, addressing Ironhawk in Lakota. The two men spoke rapidly for several minutes, their conversation too fast and complex for Sarah to follow with her limited understanding of the language. She caught occasional words, healer, white woman, sacred, but the overall meaning escaped her. What she could read was body language, and what she saw was respect between equals, concern for Ironhawk's condition, and curiosity about her role in his survival. Finally, Crazy Horse turned his attention to her, studying her face with an intensity that made Sarah feel like he was reading her thoughts and weighing her soul. You are the healer, he said in accented but clear English. I am Dr. Sarah Mitchell. You saved my cousin's life. I did what any doctor would do. Something that might have been amusement flickered in Crazy Horse's dark eyes. Number, you did what any healer would do. There is a difference. He stepped closer, close enough that Sarah could see the old scars on his hands and face, the marks of a man who had lived through countless battles. The urge to step back was almost overwhelming, but she forced herself to meet his gaze directly, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. My cousin tells me you asked for nothing in return for your care, that you treated him with honor despite the danger to yourself. Why? This wasn't just curiosity. This was a test, and Sarah understood that her answer would determine not just her own fate, but potentially the relationship between her people and his. The wrong words could mean death, not just for her, but for any white settlers or soldiers who might encounter this war party in the future. Because he was hurt, and I'm a doctor. I took an oath to heal, not to judge who deserves healing and who doesn't. Crazy Horse nodded slowly, as if her answer confirmed something he'd suspected. You speak of oaths. My people also understand sacred promises. He gestured to his warriors who began to dismount and arrange themselves in a loose circle around the cabin. Sarah tensed, but their movements were careful and respectful, not threatening. They went about the business of setting up what looked like a temporary camp. Not the aggressive positioning of men preparing for battle, but the methodical preparations of people settling in for an extended stay. What's happening? Sarah asked. We are making camp. There are things that must be discussed, ceremonies that must be performed. You have created a debt that cannot be simply forgotten? Ironhawk moved to stand beside Sarah, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. Among our people, saving a life creates bonds that last forever. You are no longer just a white woman who helped a wounded warrior. You are now part of something larger. What happened over the next several hours defied everything Sarah thought she knew about Lakota culture. The warriors didn't set up a war camp. Instead, they created something that looked more like a ceremonial gathering. Sacred items were unpacked and arranged with careful precision. Eagle feathers that caught the morning light like captured sunbeams. Carved pipes decorated with intricate symbols. Bundles wrapped in soft leather that seemed to pulse with spiritual significance. Around midday, a group of women arrived on horseback, their approach announced by the jingle of bells sewn into their clothing. They brought additional ceremonial items, and began preparing food that smelled unlike anything Sarah had ever encountered. Rich, complex aromas that spoke of traditions stretching back centuries, of recipes passed down through generations of grandmothers. The older women wore elaborate dresses covered in intricate beadwork that must have taken months to create. Each pattern told a story, Sarah realized. Victories in battle, visions received in sacred ceremonies, family lineages that connected the present to ancestors who had walked these plains for countless generations. One of the women, perhaps 50 years old with gray streaking her long braids, approached the porch where Sarah waited. She moved with the dignity of someone accustomed to respect, but her expression was warm and welcoming. "I am White Dove, mother of Iron Hawk," she said in careful English, each word pronounced with deliberate precision. "I come to thank the woman who saved my son's life." Sarah felt her heart clench at the simple gratitude in the woman's voice. Any mother would have done the same for her child. "No," White Dove replied firmly, shaking her head. "Many would have let him die for gold, or called soldiers to capture him. You chose healing over hatred." White Dove studied Sarah's face with eyes that held deep wisdom, the kind that came from surviving decades of hardship and loss. "You have lost children." It wasn't a question. Somehow this Lakota woman had read the grief Sarah carried like a scar across her heart, had seen the emptiness that no amount of professional success could fill. Sarah nodded, not trusting her voice. "I had a daughter. She died of cholera when she was 6 months old." "Ah." White Dove's expression softened with understanding, and she reached out to touch Sarah's hand with fingers that were gentle, despite their calluses. "The spirits guide those who know loss to help others avoid the same pain. This is why you were here when my son needed healing." A young woman approached, carrying an elaborately beaded dress that took Sarah's breath away. The garment was covered in intricate patterns in blues and whites and golds that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon light. Each bead perfectly placed to create designs that seemed to move and flow, like water. "This is Morning Star, Iron Hawk's sister," White Dove explained. "She has brought you a gift." "For you," Morning Star said in halting English, holding out the dress with obvious pride. "Healing woman dress." Sarah reached out to touch the dress. The leather was softer than silk, worked to a suppleness that could only come from years of patient skill. The beadwork was so intricate, it must have taken months to complete. Each tiny glass bead carefully selected and placed to create patterns that told stories of healing, protection, and spiritual power. "It's beautiful, but I can't accept something so valuable," Sarah protested, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the gift. "You must," Ironhawk said quietly, moving to stand beside his sister. "To refuse would be deeply insulting. The dress was made for a specific purpose, to honor a woman who brings healing to our people." "What exactly is going to happen?" Sarah asked, looking around at the growing ceremonial preparations. White Dove smiled, her weathered face creasing with genuine warmth. "You will be formally recognized as a friend of the Lakota people. You will be given a name in our language and a place in our tribal structure. Most importantly, you will be granted the protection of all Lakota as long as you walk this earth. And if I choose not to participate," Crazy Horse, who had been listening from nearby, stepped forward, "then you remain Dr. Sarah Mitchell, and we part with gratitude and respect. But such opportunities come only once in a lifetime. What you choose here will echo through generations. Not just yours, but ours as well." Sarah looked around at the scene that had transformed her quiet cabin into the center of a Lakota gathering. Warriors who had ridden here expecting to recover a body were now preparing to celebrate life. Women who had every reason to hate her were offering friendship and acceptance. Children played at the edges of the camp, their laughter carrying on the wind like music. For 3 years, she had lived in isolation, healing others while her own wounds remained raw and unattended. She had built walls around her heart, convincing herself that professional duty was enough to give her life meaning. But standing here, surrounded by people who understood loss and survival, who honored courage and kindness above material wealth, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her family's death: belonging. When she returned to where Crazy Horse and White Dove waited, she had made her decision. "I accept." The ceremony began when the full moon rose above the prairie, casting silver light across the gathering that had grown throughout the day. More Lakota had arrived as word spread across the territory. Elders who came to witness a historic moment, medicine men who would perform the sacred rites, families who brought their children to see something that had never happened before. The formal adoption of a white woman into the Lakota nation. Sarah had changed into the dress Morningstar had made, and the transformation was startling. The elaborate beadwork caught the firelight and seemed to glow with inner radiance, each pattern telling stories of healing and protection. The soft leather moved with her body like a second skin, and for the first time since her family's death, she felt beautiful again, not just physically, but spiritually renewed. The ritual itself was unlike anything Sarah had ever experienced in her 32 years of life. She was led to the center of the circle where the sacred fire burned, surrounded by warriors and elders who began chanting in harmony. The sound was hauntingly beautiful, rising and falling like wind across the plains, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the beating of her heart and the flow of blood through her veins. The fire itself was no ordinary campfire. It had been built according to ancient traditions, with wood from trees that had been blessed by medicine men, arranged in patterns that held spiritual significance. The flames danced higher than seemed possible, reaching toward the star-filled sky as if trying to carry the prayers of the people upward to the spirits of their ancestors. Crazy Horse stepped forward, carrying an ornate pipe carved from red stone and decorated with eagle feathers, fox fur, and beadwork that seemed to shimmer with its own inner light. The pipe was clearly ancient, passed down through generations of spiritual leaders, and its presence marked this as more than just a ceremony. This was a sacred ritual that connected the present moment to centuries of tradition. He spoke in Lakota for several minutes, his voice carrying the authority of absolute leadership and the weight of spiritual responsibility. Then he switched to English so Sarah could understand every word. We gather tonight under the eyes of Wakantanka and the spirits of our ancestors to honor a woman who chose healing over hatred, mercy over money, courage over safety. Dr. Sarah Mitchell found our war chief dying and chose to save his life despite the danger to herself. In doing so, she has proven that the bonds of humanity are stronger than the divisions of war. An elder approached, carrying what looked like a medicine bundle wrapped in white buffalo hide. When he opened it, Sarah could see items that seemed to shimmer with spiritual significance, crystals that caught and reflected the firelight like captured stars, herbs that filled the air with purifying scents that seemed to cleanse not just the air, but the very souls of those who breathed them, small carved figures that seemed to move and dance in the flickering shadows. This is Wapiti Luta, Red Elk, our most respected medicine man. Ironhawk explained quietly, his voice barely audible above the continued chanting. He has served our people for more than 40 years, guiding us through visions and ceremonies that have kept our traditions alive. He will perform the adoption ceremony. Red Elk was an ancient man, his face so weathered by sun and wind that it looked like carved leather. His hair was completely white and hung to his waist in intricate braids decorated with sacred items, bones from sacred animals, stones that had been blessed in vision quests, feathers from eagles that had died natural deaths. But his eyes were sharp and intelligent, missing nothing as he studied Sarah with an intensity that seemed to look straight through to her soul. He began to speak in Lakota, his voice carrying the authority of years and deep spiritual knowledge. The words seemed to flow like water, each phrase building on the last to create something larger than mere language. He moved around Sarah in a circle, sprinkling sage and sweet grass that filled the air with a clean, purifying scent that seemed to wash away not just the physical dust and sweat of the day, but the spiritual weight of grief and isolation she had carried for so long. The smoke from the burning herbs seemed to take on a life of its own, swirling around Sarah in patterns that defied the gentle breeze. Some of the warriors murmured in amazement, pointing to the way the smoke seemed to dance and spiral, forming shapes that looked almost like figures reaching out to embrace her. Then Red Elk placed his hands on Sarah's shoulders and looked directly into her eyes. His touch was surprisingly gentle for hands that looked like gnarled tree roots, and when he spoke, his words were in English, clear and formal. You came to us as Wasiku Winyan, white woman, But tonight you are reborn as Pajuta Win, Medicine Woman. You are no longer just a healer of bodies, but a mender of the spirit wounds that divide our peoples. The spirits have spoken through your actions, showing us that healing is stronger than hatred, that compassion can build bridges across any divide. The crowd erupted in celebration, warriors raising their weapons toward the moon, while emitting war cries that echoed across the prairie, women singing in harmony while children danced around the fire. But what moved Sarah most was the expression on Ironhawk's face, pure joy mixed with relief and something that looked like pride. Morning Star approached, carrying moccasins that matched the dress, worked with the same intricate beadwork and decorated with symbols of healing and protection. White Dove brought a necklace of carved bone and turquoise that she placed around Sarah's neck, the weight of it feeling like both an honor and a responsibility. "These mark you as one of us," White Dove explained, her voice thick with emotion. "Wherever you go, whatever dangers you face, any Lakota who sees these symbols will know you are under our protection. You are no longer alone in this world." Crazy Horse stepped forward with a medicine bag made specifically for her, crafted from the softest deer skin and decorated with symbols that represented her new role among the people. "This contains items sacred to healing," he explained as he placed the leather cord around her neck. "Herbs that grow only in sacred places, stones that hold the power of the earth, symbols that will guide you in your work as a bridge between our worlds." As the celebration continued into the night, Sarah found herself surrounded by people eager to welcome her into their community. Warriors who had terrorized the frontier for years spoke to her with respect and warmth, sharing stories of their own injuries and asking about her medical knowledge. Women gathered around her, sharing stories of their families and asking questions about healing techniques that might help their children and elders. The children were perhaps the most touching. They brought her small gifts with the solemnity of adults participating in a sacred ritual. Carved animals, pretty stones found along the creek, flowers they had picked from the prairie and woven into small bouquets. Each gift came with a shy smile and a few words in Lakota that she was beginning to understand. "Thank you, Medicine Woman." One little girl, perhaps 6 years old with bright dark eyes and braids decorated with small shells, approached carrying something wrapped in soft cloth. When she unwrapped it, Sarah saw a tiny doll made from corn husks and dressed in miniature traditional clothing. "For you," the girl said in careful English, "Medicine Woman doll." Sarah knelt down to accept the gift, feeling tears prick at her eyes. The doll was exquisite, clearly made with painstaking care and attention to detail. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Little Sparrow," the girl replied, then switched to Lakota to add something that made the nearby adults laugh. "She says you have kind eyes like her grandmother," White Dove translated. "She wants to know if you will teach her about white medicine to go with what she learns from our healers." Sarah looked into the little girl's bright face and saw her own daughter as she might have been if cholera hadn't taken her away. "I would be honored to teach you anything you want to learn." "How do you feel?" Ironhawk asked during a quiet moment, when the formal ceremonies had given way to storytelling and laughter around the fire. Sarah considered the question seriously. For the first time since her family's death, she felt like she belonged somewhere. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it was no longer the only thing that defined her. "I feel like I've come home to a place I never knew existed." That is exactly what has happened. You are Pajuta Win now, Medicine Woman of the Lakota. You are living proof that healing is stronger than hatred, that love can triumph over fear. The transformation was complete. The woman who had awakened that morning as Dr. Sarah Mitchell had become something entirely new, a bridge between worlds, built from compassion and strengthened by the belief that all healing was sacred. But as the fire burned low and the celebration began to wind down, Sarah realized that her new identity came with responsibilities she was only beginning to understand. She was no longer just a frontier doctor trying to survive in isolation. She was now Pajuta Win, Medicine Woman of the Lakota, and her choices would echo through both communities for generations to come. As the stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns, Sarah felt the weight of her new role settling on her shoulders like a sacred burden. But for the first time in 3 years, that weight felt like purpose rather than obligation, like hope rather than mere survival. She was no longer Dr. Sarah Mitchell, isolated frontier physician. She was Pehutawin, medicine woman of the Lakota, living proof that healing could triumph over hatred and that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most necessary one. Sarah woke on her first morning as Pehutawin to find that most of the ceremonial gathering had departed during the night, melting away into the prairie like morning mist. Only a small group remained, Crazy Horse and four of his most trusted warriors, plus Ironhawk's immediate family. The absence of the others felt strange after the overwhelming presence of the night before, but Sarah understood that the departure was as carefully orchestrated as everything else had been. When she stepped onto her porch, still wearing the ceremonial dress that marked her transformation, she found Crazy Horse waiting in the pale light of dawn. His expression was serious, almost somber, a stark contrast to the celebration of the previous night. "The celebration is over," he said without preamble. "Now we must speak of practical matters." Ironhawk approached from where he'd been tending to the horses, moving much more easily than he had even the day before. The ceremony seemed to have restored not just his strength, but his sense of purpose and identity. He was no longer a wounded man dependent on her care. He was once again a war chief with responsibilities to his people. "Your life has changed fundamentally," Crazy Horse continued, studying Sarah's face with those penetrating dark eyes. "You are no longer just a frontier doctor. You are Pehutawin, medicine woman of the Lakota. This brings great honor, but also great responsibility." White Dove joined them, carrying a bundle wrapped in soft leather that seemed to pulse with its own inner significance. "These are medicines from our people," she explained as she handed it to Sarah with the reverence one might show a sacred relic. "Herbs and roots that grow only in sacred places, blessed by medicine men and gathered according to ancient traditions. You must learn to use them alongside your white medicine." Sarah unwrapped the bundle carefully, revealing an array of plants and substances she had never seen before. Some she recognized from her limited study of native healing practices, but others were completely foreign. Leaves that seemed to shimmer with their own inner light. Roots twisted into shapes that looked almost like human figures. Powders that changed color as she watched. "There will be times when our people need healing that your army doctors cannot provide," Ironhawk added, moving to stand beside his mother. "Wounds of the spirit as well as the body, illnesses that strike at the very soul of a person. And there will be times when your people need help understanding ours, when fear and ignorance threaten to destroy any possibility of peace. You are the bridge between these worlds," Crazy Horse said, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy. "What you do, how you live, the choices you make, all of this will determine whether that bridge grows stronger or crumbles into nothing." Sarah felt the magnitude of what she'd committed to settling on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. "What exactly do you need me to do?" "Continue to heal," Crazy Horse replied simply, "but do it with the understanding that every life you save, every wound you mend, every person you help, whether white or Lakota, is an act of bridge building. Your hands will carry the medicine of both peoples, your heart will hold the wisdom of both traditions." Ironhawk stepped forward and took her hands in his touch warm and reassuring. "You saved my life when you could have let me die for gold. You accepted adoption when you could have remained separate. These choices will echo through generations. Pehutawin. Children not yet born will grow up in a world shaped by what you decided to do in the darkness of that night. But you must also understand the dangers," Crazy Horse added, his expression growing even more serious. "There are those among your people who will see your adoption as betrayal, who will call you a traitor or worse, and there are those among mine who will never fully trust a white woman, no matter what ceremonies have been performed or what sacred names have been given." Sarah thought about the military officers at Fort Laramie, about the settlers who had lost family members to Lakota raids, about the territorial officials who saw any cooperation with native peoples as weakness or treachery. She also thought about the Lakota warriors who had watched their own families die from army bullets, who had seen their sacred lands carved up and sold to strangers. "How do I navigate between such hatred?" "Carefully," White Dove said with a slight smile, "and with the understanding that some people will never accept what you represent. But for every heart that remains closed, there will be another that opens. For every person who chooses fear, there will be another who chooses hope. As the remaining Lakota prepared to depart, Sarah realized that her quiet life of careful neutrality was truly over. She was no longer Dr. Sarah Mitchell, isolated frontier physician who treated all comers with professional detachment. She was Pajuta Win, medicine woman of the Lakota, living proof that healing could triumph over hatred and that bridges could be built even across the deepest divides. But she was also something else, a woman who had found purpose again after years of drifting through life like a ghost. For the first time since her family's death, she felt like she was meant to be exactly where she was, doing exactly what she was doing. Iron Hawk was the last to leave, pausing at the edge of her property to look back at the cabin that had become his sanctuary, and Sarah who had become his savior. "Will I see you again?" she asked, surprised by how much the answer mattered to her. "Our paths will cross many times, Pajutawin. We are bound now by ties stronger than blood, deeper than friendship. You are part of our people's story, and we are part of yours." As he rode away, following his cousin and the other warriors toward whatever battles awaited them, Sarah stood alone in her yard and felt the weight of her new identity settling around her like a familiar garment. She was no longer alone in the world. She belonged to something larger than herself, was part of a community that valued courage and compassion above wealth and power. Over the following weeks, the changes in Sarah's life became increasingly apparent. Word of her adoption spread across the territory with the speed of wildfire, carried by travelers, traders, and the efficient network of gossip that connected even the most isolated frontier settlements. The reactions were exactly what Crazy Horse had predicted, wildly polarized and intensely emotional. Some saw her as a traitor who had betrayed her own race for the sake of savage approval. Others viewed her as a saint who had transcended the petty divisions of race and politics to embrace a higher calling. Most fell somewhere in between, unsure what to make of a white woman who claimed to have become an Indian medicine woman. But the most significant changes were in her medical practice. Lakota patients began arriving in increasing numbers, no longer afraid that seeking her help might result in capture or betrayal. They brought ailments that white doctors had never seen, injuries that required knowledge of traditional healing methods, spiritual illnesses that could only be treated with ceremony and sacred medicine. At the same time, her white patients grew more cautious. Some continued to seek her care because she was still the only qualified physician within 100 miles. But they watched her with suspicious eyes and whispered among themselves about her loyalties and motivations. Sarah found herself walking an increasingly narrow tightrope, trying to serve both communities while satisfying neither completely. But she also discovered something she hadn't expected. Combining traditional Lakota healing methods with Western medical knowledge created a more effective approach than either system alone. The sacred herbs White Dove had given her proved remarkably effective for treating certain conditions that had baffled her for years. Willow bark for pain relief, echinacea for boosting immune function, golden seal for fighting infection. Plants that generations of Lakota healers had used with remarkable success. More importantly, she began to understand the spiritual dimension of healing that Western medicine often ignored. The power of ceremony and community support in helping patients recover, the importance of treating the whole person rather than just symptoms, the wisdom of seeing illness as an imbalance that affected mind, body, and spirit simultaneously. Her cabin became a unique place on the frontier, a neutral ground where wounded from both sides could find healing without judgment. She treated Army officers with bullet wounds and Lakota warriors with arrow injuries, often in the same week. Settlers came seeking help for their sick children and found themselves learning about herbal remedies from the very people they had been taught to fear. One particularly memorable day, she found herself treating a cavalry sergeant who had been wounded in a skirmish with Lakota raiders, while simultaneously caring for a Lakota teenager who had been shot by soldiers during the same engagement. The two young men lay side by side on makeshift beds in her main room, too injured to pose any threat to each other, slowly recovering while learning that their supposed enemies were as human and vulnerable as themselves. "You really think this can work?" the sergeant asked one afternoon, gesturing weakly toward his Lakota roommate. "This whole idea of peace between our peoples?" Sarah, who was changing the bandages on both their wounds, paused to consider the question. "I think it has to work," she said finally. "The alternative is too terrible to contemplate. Endless war until one side or the other is completely destroyed." The Lakota teenager, who spoke excellent English despite his youth, nodded gravely. "My grandfather says that when the buffalo are gone and the white men fill all the land, our people will have to find a new way to live. Maybe that way includes learning from each other instead of only fighting." It was a small moment, barely worth noting in the grand sweep of frontier history, but Sarah recognized it as exactly the kind of bridge building that Crazy Horse had spoken about. Two young men from warring peoples, finding common ground in their shared humanity and their mutual desire to heal and survive. As autumn deepened and winter approached, Sarah's reputation as a healer who bridged both worlds continued to grow. She received visitors from as far away as California and New York, journalists wanting to write about the white woman who had become an Indian medicine woman, officials from the Bureau of Indian Affairs seeking her insights into Native culture, missionaries hoping to convert her back to what they saw as proper Christian behavior. She turned most of them away, having no interest in becoming a curiosity or a symbol for other people's agendas. But she did agree to meet with some, particularly those who seemed genuinely interested in finding peaceful solutions to the conflicts that were tearing the frontier apart. One such visitor was General George Crook, the Army commander responsible for military operations in the Dakota Territory. He arrived on a crisp November morning with a small escort, his weathered face showing the strain of trying to fight an enemy who seemed to vanish into the landscape like smoke. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, removing his hat as he approached her porch. "Or should I say, Pajutawin? Either is fine, General. What brings you to my cabin?" Crook studied her for a moment, taking in the mix of traditional Lakota jewelry and practical frontier clothing that had become her signature style. "I'm told you have unique insights into Lakota thinking, that you've earned their trust in ways that few white people ever have. I try to see them as people rather than enemies, if that's what you mean." "That's exactly what I mean." Crook stepped closer, lowering his voice despite the absence of anyone else within earshot. "I'm tired of this war, Doctor Mitchell. Tired of sending good men to die for causes that seem increasingly pointless. But I don't know how to end it without either surrendering completely or committing genocide." Sarah felt a spark of hope at his words. "What do you want from me?" "Advice, perspective, maybe even help in opening communications with leaders like Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull. You're the only white person I know who might be able to speak for both sides." Sarah thought about Iron Hawk, about the ceremony that had made her part of the Lakota nation, about the sacred responsibilities that came with her new identity. "I can't speak for anyone, General, but I might be able to help people hear each other more clearly." It was the beginning of a relationship that would prove crucial in the months to come, as winter settled over the Dakota Territory and both sides prepared for what many believed would be the final confrontation between the Lakota Nation and the United States government. But that night, as Sarah sat beside her fire working with the sacred medicines White Dove had given her, she felt something she hadn't experienced since her family's death. Hope for the future. Not just her own future, but the future of all the people, white and Native alike, who were struggling to find their place in a rapidly changing world. She was no longer just doctor. Sarah Mitchell, frontier physician. She was Pajutawin, medicine woman of the Lakota, living proof that healing was possible even across the deepest divides, and that sometimes the most dangerous choice was also the most necessary one. The brutal winter of 1876 to 1877 tested everything Sarah had learned about survival, healing, and the delicate balance between two worlds. Snow fell earlier and heavier than anyone could remember, trapping travelers for weeks at a time and creating conditions that made even the simplest journey a life-threatening ordeal. But it was in the depths of that harsh season that Sarah faced her greatest challenge as Pajutawin, a crisis that would define her legacy and prove whether the bridge she had tried to build between two peoples could withstand the storms of hatred and fear. The first indication of trouble came on a February morning when the temperature hadn't risen above zero in more than a week. Sarah was preparing medicines in her cabin when she heard the sound of horses approaching through the deep snow. Looking out her window, she saw a sight that made her heart sink. A military patrol from Fort Laramie, led by Lieutenant Marcus Webb, a young officer known for his aggressive pursuit of hostile Indians and his contempt for anyone who showed them sympathy. Behind the soldiers came a wagon, and Sarah's medical instincts immediately told her that whatever was in that wagon was the reason for their visit. "Dr. Mitchell," Lieutenant Webb called out as he dismounted, his breath visible in the frigid air. "We need your services." Sarah stepped onto her porch, wrapping her shawl tighter against the bitter wind. "What's the situation?" "Outbreak of some kind at the reservation. People dropping like flies, and the agency doctor is overwhelmed. We've been ordered to transport the worst cases to you for treatment." Sarah felt her stomach clench. She had been dreading this moment, the time when her role as a bridge between worlds would be put to its ultimate test. What kind of outbreak? Nobody knows for sure. Fever, respiratory problems, some kind of wasting disease. Started about 2 weeks ago, and it's spreading fast. As the soldiers unloaded their human cargo, Sarah got her first look at the patients they had brought her. They were all Lakota, men, women, and children, and they were all desperately ill. The fever had left them barely conscious, their breathing was labored and painful, and several showed signs of the kind of rapid weight loss that indicated a disease that attacked the body's ability to absorb nutrition. But what struck her most was their eyes. Not just the glassy stare of fever, but the resigned hopelessness of people who had given up expecting help. These were patients who had been failed by every system that was supposed to protect them, who had learned not to trust white medicine or white doctors. "How many more are there?" Sarah asked as she helped carry the first patient into her cabin. "Dozens, maybe hundreds. The whole reservation is in chaos." Sarah's mind raced through the possibilities. Smallpox was always a concern among native populations, but these symptoms didn't quite match. Influenza could spread rapidly through crowded conditions, but the wasting suggested something more serious. Tuberculosis was endemic on many reservations, but this seemed to be progressing too rapidly for that diagnosis. "I'll need to examine them all before I can determine the best course of treatment," she told Lieutenant Webb. "And I'll need supplies, more than I have on hand." "What kind of supplies?" "Clean water, fresh food, warm blankets, and medications from the fort's medical stores. Also, I'll need help setting up isolation areas to prevent further spread." Webb looked uncomfortable. "The commanding officer was very specific about our orders. We're to bring the patients to you and return to the fort immediately. We can't spare men to help with medical care." Sarah felt anger flare in her chest, but she kept her voice level. "These people are dying, Lieutenant. They need more care than one person can provide." "That's not our problem, Doctor. Our job is military security, not playing nursemaid to sick Indians." It was exactly the attitude Sarah had learned to expect from many frontier military officers, a dehumanizing view of native peoples that made it easy to ignore their suffering. But she also understood that arguing with Webb would accomplish nothing except to waste precious time. "Then help me get them settled and go," she said. "But I'll need those supplies within 24 hours, or you'll be transporting corpses back to the fort instead of patients." After the soldiers left, Sarah found herself alone with 12 desperately ill patients in a cabin designed to house 2 or 3 people comfortably. She had no choice but to convert every available space into a makeshift medical ward. Her kitchen became an isolation area for the most contagious cases. Her bedroom became a treatment room for the children, and her main living area became a recovery ward for those who showed signs of improvement. The work was exhausting and heartbreaking. She moved from patient to patient, checking vital signs, administering what medications she had, and trying to make them as comfortable as possible while she figured out exactly what she was dealing with. The breakthrough came on the second day when she was examining one of the children, a little girl perhaps 8 years old who reminded her painfully of her own lost daughter. Hidden beneath the symptoms of fever and respiratory distress, Sarah recognized something that chilled her to the bone: the early stages of pneumonic plague. It was a disease that could wipe out entire communities within weeks, spread through respiratory droplets, and nearly always fatal without prompt treatment. Worse, it was a disease that thrived in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that characterized most reservation settlements. Sarah immediately implemented the strictest isolation protocols she could manage in her limited space. But she knew that her efforts alone would not be enough to contain an outbreak of this magnitude. She needed help: skilled medical personnel, proper facilities, and supplies that simply weren't available on the frontier. That night, as she sat beside the bedside of a dying woman who couldn't have been much older than herself, Sarah made a decision that she knew would change everything. She would have to reach out to both communities, white and native, and convince them to work together in ways that had never been attempted before. The next morning, she sent messages in two directions. To Fort Laramie, she sent a detailed medical report describing the outbreak and her urgent need for assistance. To the Lakota leadership, she sent word through traditional channels that Pajutawin needed to speak with the medicine men about a threat that could destroy their people. The responses revealed everything about the divisions that still existed despite her efforts to build bridges. From Fort Laramie came a terse reply from the commanding officer. Military personnel could not be spared for medical duties on the reservation, and civilian authorities were responsible for managing health crises among the native population. The Army's job was to maintain security, not to provide medical care for hostile Indians. From the Lakota came a more complex response. A delegation of medicine men arrived on horseback, led by Red Elk, the ancient healer who had performed Sarah's adoption ceremony. They brought traditional medicines and spiritual support, but they also brought deep suspicion of white medical practices and resistance to the idea of working with Army doctors. Our medicines have kept the people healthy for generations, Red Elk told Sarah as they stood outside her overcrowded cabin. Why should we trust the white man's treatments when his diseases are what made our people sick in the first place? It was a fair question, and Sarah had to acknowledge the truth behind it. Many of the diseases that devastated native populations had indeed been introduced by contact with white settlers and soldiers. But she also knew that traditional healing methods alone would not be sufficient to combat a plague outbreak. Because this enemy is too strong for any one weapon, she replied, using metaphors she knew would resonate with warrior culture. A wise war chief uses every advantage available: arrows and rifles, horses and infantry, traditional tactics, and new strategies. Fighting this disease requires the same approach. Over the following days, Sarah found herself negotiating between two medical traditions that viewed each other with deep mistrust. The Army doctors who finally arrived from regional headquarters were skeptical of native healing practices and dismissive of the medicine men's spiritual approaches to illness. The Lakota healers were equally suspicious of white medical procedures and resistant to treatments that ignored the spiritual dimensions of disease. But Sarah had something neither side possessed alone: the trust and respect of both communities, earned through years of dedicated service and sealed by her formal adoption into the Lakota Nation. She became a translator not just of languages, but of entirely different ways of understanding health, illness, and healing. Slowly, painfully, she began to forge a collaborative approach that combined the best of both medical traditions. Army doctors provided access to medications and surgical procedures that could save lives in acute situations. Lakota healers contributed knowledge of herbal remedies and spiritual practices that address the psychological and emotional aspects of illness. Most importantly, both sides began to see their patients not as enemies or obstacles, but as human beings deserving of care and respect. The breakthrough came when one of the Army doctors, Captain Robert Hayes, admitted that a traditional Lakota herbal remedy was proving more effective than his imported medications for treating the respiratory symptoms of plague. At the same time, Red Elk acknowledged that Sarah's isolation protocols and sanitation measures were successfully preventing the spread of disease in ways that traditional spiritual purification alone could not achieve. Maybe, Captain Hayes said one evening, as they worked side by side in Sarah's converted cabin, we've all been looking at this wrong. Maybe the question isn't which medical tradition is better, but how we can combine them to help more people. Red Elk, who had been listening despite his limited English, nodded gravely. The spirits speak through many voices, he said in Lakota, which Sarah translated. Wisdom can come from any source, if we have eyes to see and ears to hear. The epidemic was finally contained after 6 weeks of intensive collaborative effort. The death toll was tragic. More than 50 people lost to a disease that might have been prevented with better living conditions and earlier intervention. But it could have been catastrophic without the unprecedented cooperation between white and native medical traditions. More importantly, the crisis had demonstrated something that few people on either side had believed possible. White and Native Americans could work together effectively when they focused on shared goals rather than historical grievances. Word of the successful collaboration spread across the territory and beyond, carried by newspaper reports, military dispatches, and the efficient gossip networks that connected frontier communities. Sarah found herself at the center of a debate about the future of Indian policy, with some hailing her as a visionary who had found a path toward peaceful coexistence, while others denounced her as a naive idealist who was undermining legitimate military operations. But for Sarah herself, the most important outcome was personal. For the first time since her family's death, she felt like she was living up to the oath she had taken as a physician. She was not just treating symptoms or managing crises. She was helping to heal the deeper wounds that divided two peoples and prevented them from recognizing their shared humanity. One evening, as the last of the plague patients were preparing to return to their families, Iron Hawk arrived unexpectedly at her cabin. He had been away during the epidemic, leading a war party against army supply lines, but word of what had happened had reached him even in the field. "Pajuta Win," he said, using the formal address that emphasized her role as a medicine woman. "You have done something that warrior chiefs and peace negotiators have been unable to accomplish. You have shown both peoples that cooperation is not only possible, but necessary for survival." Sarah looked up from packing the last of her medical supplies, exhausted but oddly peaceful. "I just did what any doctor would do, whatever was necessary to save lives." "No," Ironhawk said firmly. "Any doctor would have treated the symptoms and sent the patients home. You treated the disease that divides our peoples. You proved that healing is stronger than hatred." He paused, studying her face in the lamplight. "There will be consequences. There are those on both sides who profit from conflict, who see cooperation as a threat to their power. Your actions have made you enemies as well as allies." Sarah nodded, understanding the truth of his words. She had already received threatening letters from settlers who accused her of betraying her own race, and word had reached her that some military officers were questioning her loyalty and discussing the possibility of charges against her for providing aid to enemy combatants. "But you have also created something new," Ironhawk continued, "a model for how our peoples might live together when the fighting ends. And it will end, Pajuta Win. The old ways of war and conquest are dying, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. What you have built here may be the seed of a new way forward." As if to emphasize his point, Captain Hayes appeared in the doorway, having come to check on the last patients before their departure. The army doctor nodded respectfully to Ironhawk, a gesture that would have been unthinkable just weeks earlier. "Dr. Mitchell," Hayes said, "I wanted to thank you before we head back to the fort. What we accomplished here, it's going to change how I practice medicine for the rest of my career." "How so?" Hayes glanced at Ironhawk, then back to Sarah. "I've learned that healing isn't just about treating disease, it's about treating people. All people, regardless of race or politics. And I've learned that there's wisdom in traditions I was too arrogant to consider before." Ironhawk spoke quietly in Lakota, and Sarah translated, "He says that wisdom shared between peoples becomes stronger, like streams joining to form a mighty river." Hayes smiled, the first genuine expression of warmth Sarah had seen from him since their collaboration began. "Tell him that I hope our rivers will continue to flow together, even after this crisis has passed." After both men had left, Sarah sat alone in her cabin for the first time in weeks. The space felt enormous without the crowded beds and constant activity of medical care, but it also felt different in ways that went beyond mere physical arrangement. Something fundamental had changed, not just in her life, but in her understanding of what was possible when people chose to see past their differences. She walked to the window and looked out at the prairie, where the snow was finally beginning to melt, and the first hints of spring were visible in the budding cottonwood trees along the creek. Somewhere out there, Lakota families were welcoming back loved ones who might have died without the unprecedented cooperation she had helped orchestrate. Somewhere else, Army doctors were returning to their posts with new knowledge and new respect for healing traditions they had previously dismissed. It wasn't much, perhaps, in the grand scheme of the conflicts that continued to tear the frontier apart, but it was something, a small victory for the belief that healing was stronger than hatred, that cooperation was possible even between peoples who had been taught to see each other as enemies. 3 years after the plague epidemic, Sarah's cabin had become something unprecedented on the American frontier. A true neutral ground where people from all backgrounds could seek healing without fear of judgment or betrayal. The small building had been expanded twice to accommodate the steady stream of patients, and a separate structure had been built to house visitors who traveled long distances to seek treatment or training. But the most remarkable change was in the community that had grown up around Sarah's practice. Lakota families had established a small settlement nearby, close enough to benefit from her services, but far enough away to maintain their traditional way of life. White settlers, many of them former soldiers who had been treated by Sarah during various frontier conflicts, had also chosen to build homes in the area. The result was a unique community where two peoples who had been at war for decades were learning to live as neighbors. The transformation hadn't been easy or without setbacks. There had been incidents, conflicts over land use, misunderstandings arising from cultural differences, and provocations from outsiders who saw the mixed community as an abomination to be destroyed. But each crisis had been met with the same collaborative approach that had proven successful during the epidemic, with Sarah serving as mediator and translator between different worldviews. On a warm spring morning in 1880, Sarah stood on the porch of her expanded clinic, watching a scene that still filled her with wonder despite its growing familiarity. In the yard before her, Lakota children played alongside the sons and daughters of white settlers, their games a mixture of traditional native activities and frontier pastimes that created something entirely new. Nearby, their parents worked together on community projects, building a new schoolhouse, digging irrigation ditches, planning the layout of a shared marketplace. The sound of approaching horses interrupted her thoughts, and Sarah looked up to see a familiar figure riding toward the clinic. General Crook, now graying and bearing the weight of years spent trying to balance military necessity with humanitarian concerns, dismounted and approached with the careful respect he had learned to show for her unique position. "Dr. Mitchell," he said, removing his hat. "Or should I say, Pekuta Win?" "Either is fine, General. You look tired." Crook's weathered face creased with what might have been amusement. "I am tired. Tired of fighting wars that seem to accomplish nothing except creating more widows and orphans. That's why I'm here." Sarah gestured toward the chairs on her porch, and they sat together in the shade, watching the mixed community go about its daily business. "What can I do for you?" "I'm retiring from active duty next month," Crook said. "But before I go, I wanted to see this place for myself, to understand what you've built here. It's not just what I've built. This community exists because people from both sides chose cooperation over conflict, healing over hatred. Yes, but you were the catalyst. You proved that such cooperation was possible." Crook paused, his expression growing serious. "The territorial government is under pressure to shut this place down. There are those who see your community as a threat to official Indian policy." Sarah felt a familiar chill of fear, but it was mixed with determination. "On what grounds?" "Technically, violation of regulations governing interaction with reservation Indians, unauthorized medical practice across tribal boundaries, and what some are calling conducting illegal assembly of hostile natives." Crook's tone made it clear what he thought of such charges. "Practically, you've demonstrated that the government's approach to Indian affairs is not only wrong, but unnecessarily cruel. And you're here to warn me? I'm here to tell you that you have more support than you might realize, not just among progressive politicians and reformers, but among military officers who have seen the results of your work firsthand. Captain Hayes has been very vocal about the medical innovations that came out of your epidemic response. Other officers have reported that areas near your community experienced significantly less violence and unrest." Sarah thought about the letters she had been receiving from medical schools and hospitals back east, invitations to lecture on frontier medicine and cross-cultural healing practices. She had turned them all down, unwilling to leave the community she had helped build. But the fact that such invitations were being extended showed that word of her work was spreading far beyond the Dakota territory. "What do you think will happen?" Crook was quiet for a moment, watching as a Lakota grandmother taught a group of mixed children how to identify medicinal plants. "I think the old ways are dying, whether we're ready for it or not. The frontier is closing, the Indian wars are winding down, and this country is going to have to figure out how to live with the choices it's made. What you've built here isn't just a medical practice. It's a model for how that future might work. That evening, as Sarah made her rounds checking on patients in the expanded clinic, she reflected on how much her life had changed since that night when she had found Ironhawk dying in her yard. She was no longer the isolated, grief-stricken woman who had fled west to escape painful memories. She had become something she never could have imagined, a bridge between worlds, a healer who treated not just physical ailments, but the spiritual wounds that divided peoples. Her patient load that night reflected the unique nature of her practice. In one bed lay a cavalry sergeant recovering from wounds received in a skirmish with Lakota raiders, the same raiders who had brought their own wounded to her clinic the week before. In another bed, a Lakota elder was being treated for pneumonia with a combination of traditional herbal remedies and modern respiratory therapy. A white settler's daughter and a Lakota teenager, both recovering from broken bones, had become fast friends despite speaking different languages. Each patient represented not just a medical case, but a small victory for the belief that healing could transcend the boundaries that politics and prejudice tried to impose. Sarah's final stop was the children's ward, where little Sparrow, now 9 years old and fluent in both Lakota and English, was helping to care for younger patients. The girl had become Sarah's unofficial assistant and translator, showing remarkable aptitude for both traditional healing methods and modern medical techniques. "Pajuta win," Little Sparrow said, looking up from where she was reading a story to a group of children. "The new boy is scared. He doesn't understand why white children and Lakota children are in the same room." Sarah knelt beside the newcomer, a 6-year-old Lakota boy who had been brought in with a severe fever. His eyes were wide with confusion and fear as he watched white children playing quietly nearby. "What's his name?" Sarah asked. "Swift Hawk. His grandmother says he has never seen white people who weren't soldiers." Sarah smiled and spoke to the boy in Lakota, her fluency now nearly perfect after years of daily practice. "Tanyan Setanduzahan, Misun Sara Emakiapi, Pajuta Winnakun Emakiapi." The boy's expression softened slightly when he heard his own language, and Sarah continued speaking in gentle tones, explaining that this was a place where all children were safe, where healing was more important than the color of skin or the language spoken at home. Little Sparrow translated for the white children, who immediately began including Swift Hawk in their quiet games, offering him toys and treats with the unconscious generosity that seemed to come naturally to children who had grown up in the mixed community. "See?" Little Sparrow said to Swift Hawk in Lakota. "Here we are all just children who need to get better." As Sarah tucked the boy in for the night, she thought about the letter she had received that morning from Ironhawk, who was now serving as a liaison between the Army and various Lakota bands in the aftermath of the Indian Wars. He had written about the formal negotiations taking place, about the reservations being established, about the difficult transition his people faced as they adapted to a world that seemed to change more rapidly each year. But he had also written about hope, about young Lakota men and women who were learning to navigate both traditional and modern worlds, about white officials who were beginning to understand that cooperation was more effective than coercion, about the growing recognition that the model Sarah had created at her clinic might be applicable to larger questions of how different peoples could live together. "You planted a seed in the darkness of that night when you saved my life," he had written. "Now that seed has grown into something beautiful and strong, with roots deep enough to survive the storms that are coming. What you have built will outlast all of us, Pajuta Win. It will become part of the story that future generations tell about how healing triumphed over hatred." As Sarah finally retired to her own small room behind the clinic, she thought about her daughter Emily, who would have been 12 years old if cholera hadn't taken her life so many years ago. She wondered what Emily would think of the life her mother had built, of the choice to transform personal grief into a force for healing that had touched hundreds of lives. She liked to think that Emily would be proud, that she would understand why her mother had chosen to stay on the frontier, to build bridges between peoples who had forgotten how to see each other as human, to prove that love was stronger than hatred and healing was more powerful than revenge. The next morning brought news that would test everything Sarah had built. A rider arrived at dawn with word that violence had erupted at a reservation to the north, where a young Lakota man had been killed by an agent who claimed he was resisting arrest. The incident had triggered retaliations on both sides, and the situation was spiraling toward open warfare. But this time, something different happened. Instead of simply responding with more violence, leaders from both communities sent delegations to Sarah's clinic, asking her to help mediate the crisis using the collaborative approach that had proven successful during the plague epidemic. For the next 2 weeks, Sarah's clinic became the site of unprecedented negotiations between Lakota chiefs, Army officers, territorial officials, and settler representatives. The discussions were often heated and sometimes seemed on the verge of collapse. But the neutral ground Sarah had created, the trust she had earned from all sides, and the living example of successful cooperation that surrounded them provided a foundation for hope. The final agreement wasn't perfect. No agreement could have been, given the deep-seated grievances and legitimate concerns on all sides. But it established principles that would guide future interactions. The use of neutral mediators in disputes, the inclusion of Native voices in decisions affecting their communities, and the commitment to seek collaborative solutions before resorting to violence. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the model Sarah had developed wasn't just applicable to medical emergencies, but to the broader challenges of building a society where different peoples could coexist with dignity and mutual respect. 20 years later, as the new century dawned, Dr. Sarah Mitchell, Pajuta Win, had become a legend throughout the American West. The small community that had grown up around her clinic had become a town of more than 1,000 residents, both native and white, living and working together in ways that had once seemed impossible. The medical school she had established trained doctors in what came to be known as frontier integrated medicine, an approach that combined the best of Western medical science with traditional native healing practices. Her former students could be found throughout the West, carrying forward the principles she had developed. That healing was about treating whole people rather than just symptoms, that medical knowledge belonged to all humanity regardless of its source, and that the act of healing was itself a form of bridge building between communities. But perhaps her greatest legacy was in the children who had grown up in her community, young adults who saw cooperation across racial lines not as remarkable, but as normal. They became teachers and traders, doctors and diplomats, carrying into the wider world the lesson that Sarah had learned in the darkness of that long-ago night when she found a dying enemy in her yard and chose mercy over fear. Sarah herself lived to be 83 years old, practicing medicine until just weeks before her death. She was buried according to both Christian and Lakota traditions, her grave marked with symbols from both cultures, and her story told in both languages. On her headstone, carved in English and Lakota, were the words she had chosen herself. She chose healing over hatred and taught us all that love is the strongest medicine. The story of Sarah Mitchell, Pajuta Win, reminds us that sometimes the most extraordinary changes begin with the simplest choices: to help rather than harm, to see humanity rather than enemies. To choose courage over comfort when faced with suffering, we have the power to heal. In our own time, when divisions seem deeper and hatred feels more powerful than hope, her story calls us back to the fundamental truth that healing is always possible, not just for individuals, but for entire communities and nations, if we have the courage to extend mercy to those we have been taught to fear. Have you ever had to choose between what was safe and what was right? Have you witnessed someone show mercy when revenge would have been easier? Sarah's story reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous choice is also the most necessary one. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your voice matters, and your story of courage might inspire someone else to choose healing over hatred. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of the power that lies in seeing past our differences to the shared humanity that connects us all, please give it a like and share it with someone who needs to hear this message. Don't forget to subscribe to Wild West Stories for more incredible tales of courage, compassion, and the extraordinary strength of ordinary people who chose to build bridges instead of walls. Because out here in the vast landscape of human experience, there are still so many stories of hope and redemption waiting to be told. Next week, we'll bring you another remarkable story from the frontier, one that will remind you that sometimes the greatest victories are won not with weapons, but with wisdom, not through conquest, but through the simple act of choosing to see our enemies as fellow human beings in need of healing. Until then, remember, in a world that often seems divided by hatred and fear, you have the power to choose healing. You have the power to build bridges. You have the power to prove that love is indeed the strongest medicine. This is Wild West Stories. Thank you for watching, and thank you for believing that stories like Sarah's matter. Because they do. They remind us who we can choose to be, even in the darkest of times.